to give the
introduction, introduce the question.
Go for it. Carry on.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for inviting me as well. It's my second time joining this this group, so really enjoyed last time. So the question that I thought it would be good for us to talk about is related to security, and it's to do with usability and the importance of usability in successfully secure systems. Now, at one level, you know, in plain English, we can say that if we design solutions, systems, without regard to usability, then users don't use them. They find workarounds, they avoid them. So overall, we haven't maintained secure working, we haven't controlled or understood risks. In effect, we haven't made our system secure because users are avoiding systems they don't want to use. That's in plain English. What I wanted to explore today, if we can, is the more detailed question of how do we describe what we mean by usability? How do we quantify it when we are talking in more formal terms? For example, writing risk assessments, writing assessments of security designs, writing documentation so that it can be accredited or approved or go through some kind of assurance process. How do we do that? And then maybe after that question, we can think a little bit about, you know, if that's a difficult question, maybe we can change the focus to, well, if we can't describe it in an objective way, can we do it comparatively? Can we say that something is less secure, more secure, because usability is more or less? At the moment, a lot of this is done, in my experience, a little bit kind of finger in the air and very imprecisely. And it'd be great if people around the table who all have very diverse experiences, different fields, could bring their experience and thoughts actually as to how we improve the description and the explanation of usability when we are talking about the security of a solution. Does that make sense as a starting point, as a question? Does the question even make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you.
I think it's an amazing question. Actually, Izar, if you don't mind, let me answer the first one, and I'm going to tee you off really nicely, right? Because I will end up why threat modeling is part of the solution here. So let me get it right. So basically, you asked the question is how can we make sure that we measure the effectiveness, right, or the impact of security usability, right, in technology, in the solutions, right? So like quantifying the impact of almost lack of usability, right?
That's right.
In this, okay. I think the first one, the way to answer that question is to say we have to measure the risk of usability. So the way I would say that is that security solutions, because remember that everything you do has a risk, right? So one of the things I'm now getting my team to think about is that every time we have a risk, every time we have a project, for example, you have to think about the risks that you eliminate, the risks that you mitigate, but also the risks that you create, right? Because everything we do, you know, has side effects, right? So you might thinking this is a security solution, but it might actually increase risk in other areas, right? So, and there's an interesting question as do we have a net effect, right? You know, are you reducing more risk than creating, right? But because I would argue that a badly designed use system, a badly designed security solution can be worse, can add more risk to a system, can give a false sense of security, or it might not be, you know, justify the investment on it, right? So I would say the first step here is to measure the usability. And the best way to measure the usability is to measure the adoption, for example, right? Because if something is adopted, so if you measure the outcomes, right? You say, oh, I have a security solution. Ask why, what's the point of, what are you trying to achieve? And then you can measure almost the usability of the system by how much you get there, but also more importantly, how much there's the ecosystem itself starts to using that solution. So a good example is threat modeling, right? So I would argue that
think we've lost your sound.
I think he's going to have to argue that again.
Oh, Dinis, we've lost
It's an
the last
investment that you
term.
do, right?
No.
It's a security control. What is that model? You know, how can we measure that? And after
You
that,
cut there.
Sorry?
You cut there for a bit. You were going to
Okay.
argue.
Okay, so I'll argue that. So you got the bit of threat modeling.
Yep.
Okay, so I would say that threat modeling is a very important practice, right? That we need to do, but it's an investment, right? We are investing in trying to put threat modeling practices in your organization, right? So you can measure the usability of threat modeling practices by the adoption of threat modeling. Because if you think about it, threat modeling is not just, you know, doing something. You have to create an ecosystem. You have to create processes. You have to put technology in place. You have to create reward systems. You have to create visibility examples. You have to create an ecosystem that, for example, allows developers and engineers and even business individuals to do threat models, right? So if you take, and I want to measure the usability of my threat modeling security, for example, design, right? Because it is a design, right? That's something you're doing. You can use adoption as a metric for the usability of threat modeling.
I just want to make sure of one thing here, that we are talking about the same meaning for the word usability. Because I think that Tariq and Dinis are going to two different aspects of the word. So Tariq, if you would go back and define for us usability, that would probably be helpful at this point.
Yes, of course. And actually, I think Dinis is not that far from what I'm suggesting. But if there's different perspectives, it makes the discussion even more interesting. So the idea is that so the question arrives from some experience where an organization, for example, so I'll give two scenarios. One is the organization is overly controlling and wants to prevent certain actions that users can take because it is overly cautious. And what actually happens in the end is, because the controls are overly preventative, it gets in the way of what the users want to do, need to do in order to do their jobs. So they find other ways to achieve what they need using unofficial IT, insecure systems, for example. So what happens there in the local scope, we might say, oh, this is very secure because it prevents all the bad pathways. But in the global scope, it's not, because users have just moved elsewhere. The other example is also very similar. It's where you have to juggle two bad options, and one is just a little bit better than the other. So, for example, we might be working in with sensitive information with a controlled infrastructure, and we might say, well, actually, these days, lots of people have to work from home, on the move. They have to be in constant communication because that is a requirement of the job. So why don't we allow them access via their uncontrolled mobile phones, but access to some sensitive information? And it's a bit risky, you know. And the alternative is that actually they just email each other with Hotmail and Google Mail and Snapchat or whatever it is. So two non-ideal options, but the usability perspective allows us to say, actually, it's better to have people inside the tent a little bit, because if we prevent it, you know, they'll go and do something even worse. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. But if you have a different direction that you're coming at the question, that's more interesting. So please do add that in as well.
I
would use the word usable, right? You know, is it usable, right? And actually, maybe just expand to say, is it usable within the risk appetites or within the risk threshold of an organization, right? Whatever solution you have, does it actually work? And that's fundamentally usability.
Let me see if I can bring together those two views in some sort. So Tariq's first, I think that usability in security tends to be a very flowy thing. If 5-10 years ago, we would come to people and say, in order to log into your account, you have to have this hardware key in your hand, you have to have your mobile on the other one, you have to turn to the east, you have to jump 3 times, and sing a little song, people would say, I can't do that. It's not usable. The experience is horrible. I'm going to bypass this if I can. Nowadays, people are much more receptive to that thing. So exactly the same experience, because the requirements changed, creates a flow of usability in here from none to, okay, I'm fine with this. On the other hand, where does that come from? In part from threat modeling, in part from people looking at a problem and saying, hey, we do need some more controls in here. We do need some more stuff that we put in front of the system to protect it, right? So, but just to flow into that, I agree with Dinis completely that the measure of usability of a threat model, of the practice of threat modeling, for me at least, begins at how much is it being done, right? Because otherwise we are measuring that universe of things that we don't know. I can't say, hey, I did a threat model and I have 20 findings and jump around saying, yeah, it's the best threat model in the world, because I don't know if there were 21 things to be found or if there were 200 things to be found. So the number coming from the threat model doesn't really express anything to me. But if my developers come to me and say, hey, we had an experience with threat modeling and it was a positive one, and we feel that we got value out of it, we feel that we learned, we feel that we are able to be more secure today than we were yesterday, that to me proves the usability of threat modeling. If during the threat modeling, when they are thinking of the mitigations for the things that they found, they are able to develop a flow that is still useful to the end user, then we have just married usability and security at a level that everybody profits from it, right? Because I think, as you or Dinis said, if it's not usable, people are going to find ways around it, or they're not going to use it, and then everybody loses.
And you can expand that to the business, right? Like
Yes.
ultimately, if you're not aligned with the business appetite or the business direction, the business will do, make their own decisions, right? So you need to make sure that you align with that. Again, it has to be. So I like the idea of usability as a very core principle, almost like quality, right? Where whatever solutions we provide, even how we work inside a security team, right? Like everything has to be usable. It has to be well designed, and you should measure that. And I really like the idea that, we find standard ways to measure and to reward good usability in security, right? And that means, of course, it's not just the obvious ones of make sure the login experience, for example, is very smooth, but you need to apply that in a way that developers develop code, the people review things, the way users communicate security problems, the way this, for example, the security team, the monitoring team, the incident response team is able to access the logs and understand the data and have context, right? So the way you gain context, all of that fits around the idea of usability. Are you pushing solutions that actually are usable by the target of those solutions? And so going back to your original question, if you measure and if you capture that as a risk, you have a way to determine good value for money or good return of investment. Because it's a risk to push solutions that are not usable.
Yes.
Because and that's the bottom line, right? Like everything you do has a chain reaction, right? So if you invest in A and versus B, right, and A doesn't have good usability, maybe it would have been better to do B, right, that has more usability, who might not look as effective, but actually will work better.
Yep. I think there's some really interesting points. I'll just summarize a few of the notes that I've just taken before we continue the conversations. I think some really good insights. So a realization for me, and I don't know, sometimes your brain goes into kind of ice mode and doesn't work. I hadn't connected the idea of describing usability in a, say, risk assessment back to the practice of threat modeling. And I think that is because pretty much everywhere that I've seen threat modeling take place in, say, corporate environments, public sector, too often that threat modeling does not model user behavior from that perspective of usability. It very much focuses on bad actors or accidents from kind of intended users. The scope doesn't include that category of intended users actually deciding, I don't want to use this, I want to do something else. So I think that's a really good point that's been brought out to say the threat models, the threat modeling perhaps wasn't complete. So I think that's really important realization for me anyway. I think another point that's popped up, I think somebody said about it's either usable or it isn't. And I think it's actually a sliding scale. It's not binary. There's kind of 0 to 100, and that can allow you to compare different solutions. So, you know, for example, you're buying some solutions or you're comparing them, and you know, you might have both that are kind of usable, but there will be differences in usability, and they should inform the calculation of risk. And maybe we can kind of dig into that a little bit. And the third point that I've noted is the alignment with the business and what the business needs or wants to do as a business, and the appetite that the organization has for risk. Some of it will be constrained by, you know, regulation, the law. It's not allowed to take certain risks. But in other areas, it may have options for taking risk. But I think, again, speaking from the difference between theory and practice, in practice, too many business owners of products and services don't understand the conversations about risk and security. So they either take too liberal an approach and say, don't worry about it, we'll do it, stop getting in the way of users, or they get frightened and want to shut everything down, make everything quite restrictive because they're cautious. And I think that what that prompts is a challenge to us as to how best to communicate in language that they understand. And I think that's an ongoing challenge. I don't know if there's any reflections on those points from around the table there.
Is that, do you go first?
No, you go first. I have to think about this one.
So, yeah, I think that was a good analysis, right? The what I would expand is that, you know, we in security sometimes are not accountable for bad security usability that we create, and so those examples that you're saying where we end up putting the business to do a lot more, to be a lot more cautious than it should be. Ultimately, whereby, let's say, the putting solutions that are not that usable or solutions that are not that usable, right? You end up actually slowing the business down and then burning a lot of bridges, but also missing an opportunity to actually develop much more effective solutions in the business. So, you know, of course, that, you know, and the balance here is that what ends up happening is that the places where you really should put security, you then don't put security in. And that's where your breaches are going to come from. So and there's a lot of teams that you always end up with the worst of both worlds, where you slow the business down, you put a lot of effort on activities that are actually not adding a huge amount of value, and then you're not actually protecting your assets, or you're not going in the direction that the business is going, which basically means that by the time you realize, your threat landscape just grown by 10x, because the new innovation that's happening on that corner of the business has not, you don't be working with them because you don't have, again, usable solutions for them. So I feel that it's very important that we start to measure the effectiveness of our security functions, or our security activities, and usability, i.e. how usable are the solutions that we're putting in security across the board. It's a great metric for us to think about and to make ourselves accountable.
So I'm going to take this, I think, on a completely different direction. I think that Tariq has basically touched down on a realization, or rather an enlightenment point that happens in the life of most people that work with developers and with AppSec, which is there is such a thing as too much security. So if I don't want somebody to steal my car, and my solution to that is to take away the 4 wheels, I basically kill the car. The car's not going anywhere, right? Nobody's going to steal it. That's true. but it's not going to travel anywhere as well. So at some point in the career of anybody involved with this stuff, I think that if they haven't yet, they have to realize that security may just not be the first value on the pyramid. And that sometimes we have to accept the fact that some risk will be carried in the name of the product actually going out and doing what it's supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
And
it's about understanding what you're trying to do. You know, a better analogy is when you do fingerprint technology to open up cars, right? And you say, oh, it's great. I can go to the car and I can open the car with my fingerprint. What did the guys start to do? They start to chopping up your fingers, right? And then you would argue, I much prefer to keep my finger, right, than to have that car. So it's a great example of a really good security feature, right? Use biometric authentication to get into your car. But then you realize that from a user point of view, a customer, they risk losing something much more important to them, which is their finger, than their car. So it's a security solution that backfires, right? So you could argue that actually, even it might feel more usable, is actually not, because the unintended side or the side effects of that security solution are actually worse for the target of those security solutions, which is the customer.
I don't know if I would call that a usability problem. It sounds to me a bit more like a second order or an intended.
Yeah, but that's as part of usability, right? Every side effect is part of usability, right? You cannot just say, oh, the first degree is great. You know, if the second, third, fourth order of what you created has massive problems, right? It's like saying, oh, you just create a single point of failure because of everything you've done. Well, guess what? That is part of the challenge. And going back to your idea of too much security or lack of resilience or some things, nature shows that sometimes you achieve resilience by having lots of systems that not one of them is perfect. Yep. Not one of them is because you know what? When they fail, they don't fail catastrophically.
Yep.
So I would argue that a system that fails catastrophically might be answering only one part of the brief. But the point of this is no security solution exists in isolation, right? The point of a security solution is to protect the system, is to protect something, is to achieve a certain objective, right? So that's why I like the usability, because I would also argue that from a easy useful, right? You have to look at the unintended side effects of that. It's not just enough to look at the first level and go, oh yeah, I meet my objectives, it's great.
Izar, you were I think you were about to finish a point you were making earlier. Was there something you wanted to carry on with the car analogy? Was there something you wanted to take with that?
No, I think the car analogy went more towards, you know what, too much security can even kill a system's purpose. To go to a very large extreme, as Dinis said, it can create costs and risks that we haven't seen before or thought of. But
that's very connected to the example Tariq was saying, right? Where you put security controls in place that are too onerous, right? That basically push users to do something else. That's the same thing, right? You put a security control in A that forces users to do B, and B ends up being a lot more insecure, right? Then A is failing, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think the point you also raised, Dinis, is around learning from nature and having a managed diversity of what you might call robust solutions. So if one fails, the whole thing doesn't fail. The word anti-fragile comes to mind. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the works of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He writes things like a book called Anti-Fragile, or sort of Fooled by Randomness and so on. You don't have to agree with everything he says. I don't, but he does. He has the talent of getting us to think a little bit differently about things that we think we know about. And I really learned, I think, his ideas around anti-fragility and what you said, Dinis, about building grand solutions that actually answer a very specific question, but fail when the question is different, is really, really interesting. I wonder if I can take this discussion towards this question of mapping out those scenarios, so we've talked about some scenarios that are unintended consequences. We've talked about the hypothetical pathways where users just don't use the system and do something else or use shadow IT. Now, does anyone have any experience or thoughts on how we can best map those up front, or is that a completely lost cause and we will only ever map those scenarios by iteration, by learning, and therefore by necessity we will see some of those failures and we have to learn from them? Or is there some discipline or procedure for saying, actually, we run workshops, we watch users, there is a discipline around user behavior research, and it can take us quite far, and anything else is truly unintended? And any thoughts around the table on how to maximize the mapping of those kinds of behaviors as ahead of time as possible?
Yeah, Izar, you want to go first?
No. I'm looking at around the room to see if somebody's coming up.
Well, sorry guys, I got home now. Yeah, look, I think actually, right? Come on, Izar, you got an open goal here, right? Like, look, threat modeling, it's a great way to identify that, right? If you think about it, if you do threat modeling early on in a system, right, you can start to ask the question, is this thing going to be usable, right? Like I really remember vividly doing a threat modeling on a system that when the guy it was actually a threat modeling of a security function, right, a security practice, and I remember asking the guy who was doing the drawing, I says, this is great, I totally get it from a security point of view, love it, right, but can anybody use this? Like, can your developers, can your users actually use this properly the way you design? And then the guy went on a rant to say no, and everybody keeps making mistakes and they don't get it. I'm like, dude, like, I was trying to point him to the obvious. It's like, you create a system that only a couple of people can use. For example, only a couple of developers can use. And by the way, the concept of usability, I extend that to security controls. I extend that to developer practices. Right? If you have a security architecture that requires a huge amount of complexity by the developers to, for example, do authentication, what will happen is a huge amount of authentication failure, right? So the way, one of the things I always ask, going to a key question, is I always try to look beyond the problem, beyond the vulnerability, beyond the incident. So for me, a much bigger vulnerability is not that something happened or something was exploited or vulnerability occurred, is why did we miss it? Why did we miss the 25 signals or the 10 signals or the 5 signals that we should have seen there? And then you look back and you realize, well, whatever caused that gap, that's the real vulnerability, right? And sometimes it's lack of threat modeling, right? Sometimes it's lack of understanding why something happened, but also it's really powerful to go to past threat models and go, hey, we missed this, right? It's almost like reality then shows you what happened. You go, well, we thought that this would happen. We thought this was not possible, but we didn't have this threat in here, but actually it just happened. So I think, going to your question, can you detect this before? I think you can, right? In fact, as with everything, the sooner you can detect, the better. But the next best thing is to use your incidents, use reality to find those gaps, right? Because also nothing happens in isolation, right? So if you find a gap over here, look around, because you might find the exact same pattern in tons of other places.
So, Izar, did you want to add to that? I do have a point to come back, but
I think that under the umbrella of everything is connected, I think that we may have connected things a bit too much here and confused me completely. One thing I can tell you, and perhaps I'm just too jaded at this point, right? But when I'm doing threat modeling with a team, and what we are calling here the concept of usability comes up, the way that Dinis illustrated, something that is too complex or too whatever to actually be workable, not to work, to be workable, right? I think that that's when you start measuring complexity by this strange unit called the WTF per minute.
because people will start looking at that design and start looking at that proposed solution and just start going, what the F? What the F? What the F? What the F? You want us to do what? And the usability gets filtered by that experience of people. So a developer gets shown, hey, these are the API calls that we want you to do and that are going to help your security. And they see strange pointers, or they see strange tokens that they have no clue where they're coming from. And they see all kinds of, I don't know, strange calls in strange orders. And they go, I can't work with that. It's too confused, right? So at that point, the usability is going to come up and say, no, that's not usable, so find a different solution. But I don't see that happening as a separate measurement during the threat modeling. I see it as an emergent thing coming from the process, not even of threat modeling, but the process of designing and architecting a sane system. And God knows I have seen enough insane systems in my life. And if somebody at some point would have stopped and said, wait, this looks cool, but it's a horrible idea down the road, you know? I'll give you an example. Recently, I had to go and run a piece of code inside a staging system, right? It was like 4 or 5 lines of Python that I just wanted to see if something works. In order to do that, I had to stand a server. In order to do that, I had to stand a Kubernetes cluster or whatever. In order to do that, I had to go into 3,000 different YAML files and change those things. In order to do that, I had to be in a different group. In order to do that, I had to change another YAML file. In order to do that, I had to run another. Just to change 4 lines of freaking Python. At this point, it's not even what the F, it's what have we done, right? I mean,
but that's reality, man. I was having this argument with one of the WAF, global WAF.
But Dinis, it's reality.
I'm not going to name here, but I was like saying, security guys are doing fucking heart surgery, right? Which is ridiculous. In fact, you could argue that's more dangerous than whatever you were trying to solve.
Sorry,
think about it, like
there, and I missed the
I was saying that what you talk about, for example, I had this with one of the WAF vendors, right, where we're blocking IPs, and I was saying that UI to block IPs is insane, and it's actually so easy to make mistakes that you could argue that it's actually, you know, it's almost like the security engineers are doing, or the DevOps engineers are doing freaking heart surgery, right, to make those changes. And in your example, you could have a situation where you could cause more problems than the problem you're trying to solve if you made a mistake, right? But you see, if you take a step back, the problem there is the usability of the systems. So I would argue those are massive risks because the system is not usable. So it forces you, the developers, the operators, to basically to do very dangerous activities. In fact, you should go to them and say, you are going to have 5 P1s. In fact, you already had them. You're going to have another 5 P1s. And the root cause is not the individual that made a mistake. It's because you create a system that promotes the creation of mistakes because it has no, almost like no, you know, it's like saying, here's a bridge from here to there, but there's no fucking, you know, side gates, right? Whatever, side rails, right? And it's a little bit wide, but every now and then somebody falls over, right? And you go, well, they will fall over because there's no other security measures in that place. So the example you're just describing is an example of how, and I think we miss the trick by not measuring that. Like we miss the trick in security by not measuring that gap.
It's not even a problem of the security of the thing. It's a problem, actually, it's a double problem. When I actually got to the point where I could add the 4 lines of Python that I wanted,
yeah.
You mean if I knew what I wanted to do, I forgot already. Because I went so deep into the mind.
But think about it, like
there are so many points of failure in here.
Yeah.
Where, as you're saying, security could fail.
Exactly.
How can we call this usable?
Yeah, but it's not, right? But what you need to do is you need to map, you know, you can actually use usability and security risk and almost like bad design as a risk in itself, right? Because you think about it, like just about every security vulnerability that we talk about is a mistake somewhere down the line, right? You could even argue that when a developer creates a SQL injection, that is still a mistake because the framework should not allow that to happen, right? Or the framework should be allowed to allow it to easy scan. And even like when we create most vulnerabilities, there's a mistake down the line. And I would argue that we need to create environments that prevent those mistakes from being created in the first place, or make it really visible when that is happening, right? So people almost have to whitelist the insecurity, say, yes, it's okay for this thing to behave like that because I have other controls in place, right? So what you describe is a badly designed system, right? It's a system that when you take a step back, right, the system is so wired together that is not usable, and the security, basically the vulnerabilities in the system are caused by the lack of usability in how the system is designed, right? And actually, and if you want really good data, Tariq, look at the data that comes out of the DevOps movement, where they start to say that when you build systems that have really good DevOps, for example, shift to production very fast, you end up with much more resilient and secure systems, right? Because you can make change very fast. So even if you made a mistake down the line, the fact that you can correct them very easily gives you, in the big scheme of things, a much more secure system. So these days, I would argue to the app tech teams, the best way for them to make a system more secure is to start by improving the CI pipeline. If the business doesn't have a decent CI pipeline, doesn't matter how many vulnerabilities you find, freaking help them to build a better CI pipeline, or because once they have that, not only getting a lot of great advantages and you have a place to put your security controls in line.
I'm just going to pause and summarize some of those points again, because I think they're fantastic points. I've been making some notes. So I started this discussion with my mind a little bit too much focused on end users, customers, citizens, public. But actually, this discussion has also moved on to those people who develop and maintain a system and the usability from their perspective. And I think a really important point has emerged, which is we are human, and therefore our brains have a natural limit to the complexity that we can deal with. And therefore, there are some designs that are simple enough to be safe to use, and some designs that are so complicated, it is just irresponsible to give them to humans to manage. And I think one phrase that comes to mind, one of my mentors used to ask it a lot actually, is how many things need to go wrong before there is a serious failure? How many small things need to go wrong? How likely are they? So I think that's a really important point to underline. It's usability is not just for end users, but those who develop and maintain and have to look after a system. And if that aspect of it is overly complex, then there is a risk there. The discussion actually moved into a really interesting space, and it was a point I was going to make earlier. And it was when I was talking about upfront enumeration of pathways and risks and scenarios, and shifting away from that to say, okay, we have as an industry, we have a body of knowledge about the things that we all know commonly go wrong. We can call that level one. These are the things that you should always kind of think about, but actually that is incomplete. And what that I think suggests is the inevitability of the iterative approach. So you will inevitably find scenarios that go wrong, vulnerabilities exploited, accidents that happen, and you didn't plan for them, you didn't know about them, and that's natural. We should be at peace with that. But what that does prompt, I think, is perhaps suggesting different approaches to the way architecture is realized, built, and made live. So rather than saying, here is a design, let's kind of accredit it and write a signature on it, and now go and build it, maybe actually we should think about breaking it into smaller pieces and saying, this part will go live. Or if it can't be done in that way, we say it will go live with a limited set of users or a limited set of data, so that we grow iteratively, so that we discover in a controlled way new scenarios that go wrong. So the car example with the fingers being chopped off, we don't do that in one jumping off the cliff edge. we do that at a slower pace. And we might even learn, if we're lucky, that the criminal fraternity are thinking about doing this before it actually happens. So I'm wondering if actually the deployment and exposure of the risk surface should be done in a phased manner. I don't know what your thoughts are. That's where this discussion is taking me. And any responses?
That's the process of soft launching your startup, right? You get your basic functionality out there, let people poke and all that. But I think that just to go back to a point that Dinis was making before, I think that we can all agree that complexity and usability and security are a pair. Complexity on one side, the other two on the other side, of inversely related values. Complexity goes up, it's natural that usability and security are going to go down, right?
All right, with a curveball, right? Sometimes
no,
complexity.
The other way, it's not true.
But sometimes complexity gives you security, right? But sometimes complexity gives you security, right? This is why context is important, right? Context is important, right? No, because just very quickly, devil's advocate on that one. I remember once did a project where we were moving from folders to a content management system, and when we found piles of vulnerabilities in the content management system, I remember saying, the irony is that you're less secure with the content management system because people can find stuff before they couldn't, right? And one of the points was to protect data, right? So there are scenarios where complexity, going back to the human nature, right?
Security obscurity. That's no.
It is. No, but it's a metric, right? No, but it is a metric, right? But okay, but that would just be a devil's advocate. The thing I wanted to say is that creating simple solutions is really hard. So the core principle is absolutely correct. Complexity creates insecure systems, right? And the problem here is simple is not simplistic, right? Creating simple solutions means they are usable, right?
Yes.
And we can see that, right? And that's why, and there's a great question, there's a great, absolutely spot on comment here from Mel, right? Which basically says, actually said it to me, says, several approaches exist to improve usability during design, right? There are people who specialize in usability and UI design, can we align security features and requirements in usability use case and tests? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, I wish a lot of those professionals joined the security, right? Because they are the best threat models. They are the best at this level. They are great designers because they understand usability. They understand users. They understand use cases, right? So we need more of them, in our mix, and we need to embrace them and go to them and collaborate with them and help them to design better solutions for the business.
And they are the people who are going to jump up whenever we propose something and say, what the F? Because they
exactly
think in a completely different point of view. So most of us threat modeling practitioners have been proposing for a long time that the diversity of the team doing the threat modeling and the lack of the hero threat modeler is one of the most important things in order to get that value, right? So just going back to what we started on, the usability of threat models, if you don't have that diversity, if you don't have the people who do QA, the people who do usability, the people who do user experiences and all that kind of stuff in there, you are not going to catch this kind of stuff. So it's very important to have them around the table.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's important just to say that usability, you cannot just view in one bit, right? You have to look holistically, and you have to look at what you're trying to do. And sometimes moving the needle a little bit is better than not moving at all. And sometimes, but there's sometimes where you have to move the needle completely, right? And there's sometimes where by design, you have to make it harder. And that's okay, right? And for me, that's usable, right? You can build a system that's by design, designed to put checkpoints in the system and designed to have circuit breakers. Guess what? There's but look, a ship, right, has freaking flood doors, right? Which you could argue their usability problems with the flood doors, but they prioritize the ship survivability, right? Versus maybe a couple of people, right? It's a tough decision, but you either sink the whole ship, right? Or you say, I'm going to lose 3 containers or 3 blocks, right? But that's an example of a secure, but it's also a security measure that is designed, for example, to only trigger in certain situations, right?
But a place that I would want to take this to is something that I think Dinis mentioned a couple of minutes ago. At some point, we have to be a bit meta about this stuff, because we are building a product. That product is built on top of a pipeline.
Yeah.
We have a population of engineers that's responsible for both of those. And if the people building the pipeline don't take usability and usability of security into mind, then you end up in a situation like mine, where you have to jump through so many hoops just to get something in the product that's out there, that even that beautiful thing that Dinis referred to, that you will build this amazing pipeline, and you know what? It works great as long as nobody touches it.
Yeah, but then that's not usable.
No, it's usable because it's doing its thing.
No, it's not usable. Well, put it this way, if your system is okay with having one person or two person at one time maintaining all of it, that's fine. Then that's your design criteria. If you need a system that is maintained 24 hours a day and other people can make changes and it can evolve, etc., right? Then it's not usable because it's an accident waiting to happen, right? So, and we create this. And I actually think we in security sometimes don't leverage the knowledge that we have to start putting the risks in the right individuals. To say, hey, guess what? Whoever does, first of all, how much are you investing in your DevOps? How much are you investing on this? And you go, well, if you're not investing on that complexity, then you can almost tell you that you're going to have X incidents, you're going to have X vulnerabilities in here. And the reason is not because your developers or your DevOps understand security. In fact, you can give them 2X training, you can give them 5X more tools, etc. They're still going to create problems because the root cause is here, right? And if you have this massively broken pipeline with not enough visibility, super complex stuff, etc., then where are you going to invest?
But I think that going back to the usability of the thing, sometimes we say, okay, people are building stuff that's too complex just because it's complex. But sometimes, and I see this a lot in security, people are building things just because they are too flashy. So the usability gets lost because we want that one or other tool, and that one other tool, and the other one too, and now we have to build a glue thing to put all of them together. Even if it's completely different, we are going to like force these things to work together, right? And that's when the guy says, well, it's huge resume, I do all the things, and then he moves on to another place, and we stay with the broken thing.
Yeah, that's why in security, one of the things I try to measure is exactly, again, the unintended side effects of you doing something. And this is why when we have controls, are like the way I like to deal with those more, I'll say, cavalier teams, because you have two sides of almost two types of teams. You have the teams who do that, but they really know what the hell they're doing, and they actually would always do stuff better than you can. They actually are better security professionals than we are. Let's be clear, right? A hell of a developer, right? The top elite, best-in-class developers, architects, etc. They will do security better than we can, right? Because they just know it, right, really well. The problem is the other team who does exactly what you described: cavalier, go for the stuff, doesn't think through what they need to do. The best way to deal with those guys or those teams is to have standards, to say, hey, you want to authenticate, you can either use this control, or you need to do something that does this. You want to have access to this data, well, you need to protect it like this. Here's a framework that gives you the security controls. You're free to do whatever you want, but this is the bar of entry, right? Now, when they are cavalier, they're going, well, yeah, I could use that shiny thing, but actually it doesn't have this. So actually, I'm going to have to work much harder, right, to do what I want to do. And then you nudge them in the right direction.
But haven't you heard the news? If you put standards in place, that slows us down, so we can't be as usable as we should be.
Yes, but yeah, no, absolutely, right? But this is the debate we're having, right? But the way to do it is the touch points of the assets, right? So you could say you want dedicated users, then this is the thing. You want data, here's the thing. Look, I'm on this. I'm now making a case to say, if you want to use our brand, here are the requirements. If you want to use outside the brand, then that's fine, right? It's almost saying, hey, you guys want to behave like that?
I'm totally on your side.
Yeah.
But it is usually what I hear from people whenever I come and say, hey, we have this reference design, we have this standard that you can use. then immediately is, oh, the moment that you put that in place, you are giving us a gate, you are stopping us on an older version of something, you are not letting us move at the speed, what is it that they call it this week? Moving at the speed of fail and whatever, right? So yeah, there are trade-offs.
Yeah, but the only way to have that conversation rationally, I was saying that the only way to have that conversation rationally is to redefine the rules of the game, right? And we get to redefine the rules of the games because we get to define what are the properties. So, and the good news is it allows innovation, right? If somebody comes along and says, I got a framework that does that by design, we go, fuck yes, awesome, do it, right? But it forces also them to think about the different properties, right? And then it helps if you have incidents that you can use as examples of what happens when they don't do that, right? And you're going, but then it's this is where you also have the risk assessment, right? Because the risks and risk acceptance is key. Because you go to them and saying, okay, cool, so you want to ship that thing, then you and your manager and your manager and your manager's manager have to accept the fact that this thing doesn't have any security controls.
Yep.
So yeah, cool, ship it to production, but make sure everybody on the thing knows that this is being done we have done no security assessment, there's no security things, there's no security measures, so they take full responsibility for anything that happens. Now that's tough to build, but if you build that, those teams start to think a bit differently. Then they go, oh, can we use common platforms?
I think just a thought from me on because you mentioned the word standards and common practices, and the kind of the thought from myself is you're absolutely right that it can be seen as slowing down, but I think it's about context. So if we have a team of 2 people, a small team developing a new startup, then you probably don't need heavy standards for the development team because it's just 2 people. However, the larger the team gets, the larger the project gets, the more teams that are involved, multiple teams, there is higher risk of miscommunication, lack of understanding, diversions of practice, and that's where the standards can de-risk some of that. So it's a balance between slowing down and chaos, and I think that's where standards can shine when you otherwise have the risk of so much chaos. I think we've come to the end of the allotted hour. I'm very happy to carry on, but I just wanted to summarize some of the last part of the conversation where actually different terminology was emerging, different concepts that need different terminology. So initially I started talking about usability from an end user's perspective, but actually the discussion moved on to complexity of a system. For those who have to design it, manage it, update it, look after it. So complexity is an orthogonal or a different dimension to this problem. And I think really interesting where this discussion went, different terminology again. And I wouldn't use usability here. I would say it's about the robustness or the anti-fragility of a system to unexpected change or accidents. So you talked earlier about building great big towers just for CV building that are over-engineering, but and they may be kind of great on somebody's CV, but actually they increase the risk of failure, of things going wrong because there's more stuff to go wrong. Interactions become n squared complex or in exponential, whatever it is. So I think robustness to unexpected events is a really important concept. And that points to simplicity, doesn't it? And it goes back to the 1970s software engineering idea of small, loosely coupled, well-defined bits of software, which are kind of easier to kind of model in terms of how they interact, rather than great big cathedrals. We go back to the same old lesson. So for me, that was really interesting. I didn't know which direction this conversation would go in. I suspect we could carry on talking. I'm very happy to stay on and talk for more if others want to.
No, let's do another session. Is right. Look, the thing that I would say for what you just mentioned is that we actually have, there's actually data that shows that when you provide good standards for building blocks, you go faster, right? There's already good data on it, and you can see that the teams that can go faster, right, is the ones that build that. The problem we have in the past is every time we push a standard, by definition, it's a standard that was old. It was a really bad way of doing things, was not modern, right? But even my own personal experience in development and building systems is like the worldly maps, right? So if you goes back to commoditization, right? So a standard is a product, is a commodity, is you commoditize something, you commoditize logging, you commoditize authentication, you commoditize authorization, you commoditize data validation, you commoditize secrets management. All of these are complex stuff. This is where a lot of the teams get it wrong. We need to give good solutions that are fit for purpose for the dev teams, like SaaS now. A lot of teams want to go into SaaS. Well, we have to have a way to plug into SaaS providers. In fact, even better if we can do it on procurement, where we can have a voice to say, hey, okay, there's these free providers. Actually, that one, which you might not think is the best one because it doesn't have these shiny features over there, is a lot better from a security, from this and from that, and that point of view. Are those little shiny features worth it? All this extra work that even you might need to have to do. And then sometimes people going and says, actually, no, because they're just good to have. That's not the key thing I wanted. So I feel that creating that positive feedback loop, right, on how you're evaluating something is super important. And the punchline is that the same way that DevOps makes you go faster, good security practices, good security standards, good security modules will make you go faster, including on the medium term, right? Because, and this is why the car analogy is great, because the car analogy of the cars go faster is not just the brakes that allow the car to go faster, right? Of course, brakes are a big thing, but is steering, is visibility. You can even argue the way the dashboard is designed allows it to go faster, right, than other ways. So every one of those details makes a difference, right, in the way the car goes faster, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, fantastic. Are there any questions that you can see from anyone else in case we missed a question from attendees?
No, I think that was the one.
Okay, fantastic.
So let's do another session. I love usability.
Yeah.
I think it's great. There's actually a lot of other people that I've started talking about this. So I definitely think we should have a bigger panel on usability.
Yeah,
so
no,
great.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Right.
Brilliant, fantastic. Great. Thanks for inviting me, and really good discussion.
Now let's do another
Fantastic.
one. Izar, any final thoughts?
No. I have to say that I love the fact that we could come at this at different angles and like look at it on. At the end of the day, again, it's very meta because we are developing computing systems using computing systems. So the same obstacles that we are trying to turn over are the ones that other people are imposing on us in order to get that thing done. So it's all
Yeah. Izar, can I ask? There's a picture behind you on the wall. Is it a book on threat modeling?
Which one
is
is
behind? The one that's lower.
This
fish. Yeah. Is that your book? Is it?
Yes.
Okay. I'll have a look. Oh, fantastic. I'll check it out. Fantastic.
All right.
Brilliant.
All right. Brilliant, guys. Good stuff.
Thanks. Thank you.
I'll catch you later.